In the last few lectures, we were talking about CSS attribute selectors. We're going to go back to CSS2 now, and we're going to visit the lang attribute. Well, that lang selector. It's a pseudo selector. It's anything that starts with a round bracket, which is going to be the first one that we see. It looks like a function if you know JavaScript. Basically is a more advanced feature that is not going to support a lot of other things that we're going to see. You can't nest advanced features one inside of each other. So you cannot nest inside of anything that we're going to see later on, the selector that we're going to see currently. Now, what does it do? The language enables us to create basically customizations based on a language in our CSS. Now, in general, Google suggests and most search engines suggest that you separate your HTML pages per language. So don't serve up the same HTML page that will serve up to your customers or users that speak completely different languages. With that said, my personal suggestion to you is if you have a brand and you don't have the capability of maintaining completely separate entities for example, your French users versus your Canadian French users, but you do want to add a little bit layer of customization, such as in headlines, where you just want to give those users a little bit of a level of personalizations to those communities, the language attribute could become very, very useful. And we're going to take a look at that in this lecture. By the end of this lecture, you're going to know everything you need to know about the language attributes and selectors and what could you do with them and what can't you do with them. So let's jump right into it and see it in action. Alright, so we're taking a break from a lot of CSS rules and we're going to focus on one. It's a little bit of a practice. It's a CSS2 selector, which enables us to control languages. While we were away, I've added 3 new headlines, one with bicycle in American English, a second with bicyclette, I believe, which is in Canadian French, and vélo in French, which all mean bicycle. But really, if you're creating a website and imagine that it's in French, or even in that case, if you're in American English or British English, but you don't want to create a brand completely new page for the content. So if you want to create the same page and there's just some small changes that you want to create to the page, there are ways for you to define those small little differences. You probably wouldn't put a lot of different languages in one page from a level of you don't want to load up the page with too much information, but if it's small things such as headlines, where you want to create a little bit of customizations based on where the user is, the lang attribute, it becomes incredibly powerful. Now, I want to show you the lang attribute in general in HTML, and you'll notice in all of our documents, in our defining element in our HTML, we defined it to be in English. I'm going to go ahead and change that to FR because our document is actually going to be based off of French, even though that it is very much in English. Now, if you scroll down and find our headlines that we've just added in, you'll notice that I've added a language attribute to each of them. One is French Canadian, another is French. And what I want to do next is I want to basically define a specific styling rule and to be able to control and gain access to specific elements. So, for example, if I go ahead and say, in all of this document that speaks French, I want to build a new rule. And this new rule that I want to build is very explicitly to everything that is French, assuming we're on the French page, because the CSS could be used both for the French language and many other languages as well. In this case, let's do something relatively theoretical. Maybe we know that people that speak French really love it when their backgrounds are red. In that case, we would go ahead, and I'm just going to go ahead here and just create here another CSS2 rules for language. So let me just find here a spot for that. And I'm just going to paste it right here. And this we're talking about CSS2 language selectors. Now, the rule is incredibly easy. I first define what property do I want. In this case, really, I want everything. So I'm going to start with a star there. And I'm going to set the language by setting the property lang, opening up a round bracket, and then defining the language itself. In this case, I want everything that is French to be highlighted. Let's say I want its background to be red. Now, in this case, once I define the French, anything that is French, for its background to be red, let's see what would happen. I'm going to click here at refresh, and notice how everything now turned French, because everything in our document is French. That's not really true, right? So let's go ahead here and revert back our full document to be in English. And notice where the red color will be defined this time around. This time around, only the French related languages such as bicycle, which was in Canadian French. Notice that differentiator, where it was FR-CA for Canadian French, or FR for French French. Now, Parisian French, more accurately, or European style French. In this case, if I only wanted for French that is Canadian to be red, then maybe I would highlight that Canadian French to be in red. A more realistic scenario is you might want to basically assume that if the add, usually you would do this in JavaScript, where if, for example, anything that is Canadian French, let's hide. So I would go ahead there, and instead of setting it to be red, I would say display none. And I basically get rid of that item because I know that I'm only interested in showing the French language item. So anything that has a language separator that is not that specific language would then be automatically removed. Now, obviously, something like that I would probably do with the help of JavaScript. Or in that case, I would add an extra logic into the HTML page itself and inject just those extra words that would just get rid of a specific language that is not being controlled right now. JavaScript would probably be a really good scenario for this, because if someone does not support JavaScript, they'll just see both headlines. But if someone does support JavaScript, then we'll go ahead and remove the content that is not relevant to them in that specific time. So that we're not going to cover that because that is a separate title which is working in JavaScript. But before we wrap up this conversation about languages, I want to talk about one more thing. We've met already before, earlier, we've met the possibility of creating different CSS access rules. And one of those access rules that we've met not long ago was the pipe. And we said the pipe basically enables us to select an item that starts with a specific value that is dash separated, remember? So if I didn't want to do French, for example, here, and I'm just going to go ahead here and just comment this out here for a second. And if instead I went ahead and said, hey, by the way, anything that starts with anything, right, that has a property which is called lang, that its value is starting with the value of fr, then we want to do something to it. So for example, we want to set that value to be display none. Or in this case, really, let's set it exactly to be the same type of sample with FRCA. It works very similarly, but the difference is quite big. Now, you're not going to recognize the difference immediately. If we go ahead and we click on refresh, we'll notice that we're still getting rid of that Canadian French. But the only big difference between the two is this. If I went ahead here and I set to be, for example, I set our whole document to be inside of that specific language. So I'm going to go ahead here to my language, and I'm going to set that language to be FRCA, Canadian French. Our whole document is Canadian French. Now again, instead of making it invisible, let me just use that red color because we don't want our whole document to disappear. So let me just delete that. I'm going to go ahead here, set that background to be red. And if I click on refresh, notice what happens. Notice that even though I've selected supposedly everything, and everything here in this document is now French because I defined the whole document to be red, right? The whole document to be Canadian French. So I would assume that everything here would be Canadian French, but not true. Because I was using a property directly, so it's true. The whole body, the whole page is red. That paragraph is red. The whole thing is red, but everything else is not. And that is the big difference, or the small difference really, between the language attribute when you're defining it directly with the language itself versus not using the language and instead of that using an attribute. So in this case, when we had this starting with FR, then everything that would be in French would start, but it would still not solve our problem or our desire if we said that the whole document is French and we set the whole document to be French. This would not work. This would only work in a scenario where we only want specific items that are defined in that rule. But really, many times what we would really want is, for example, if we have this FR, but inside there are sub divs, sub whatever's inside there, they would not be affected. Only the parent itself would be affected. So if we want all to be affected, when we're using the language, by default, it will automatically affect all of the items. So that's really the big difference between the FR, the the language itself, using the language versus using the property definers that we've met earlier. So here we go. If we set it, we'll see that all of the page will be affected. And I'm just going to set here because we set it to be display none, so that made the whole document invisible, which is obviously not what we want. So I'm going to go ahead there back into our HTML document and make sure that we're actually defining it to be English as a default. And there we go. That's it. That's the core of working with language in general. We're not done with that topic completely, although we've seen how to work with it now inside of the laws that govern CSS2. But now that we're living in the CSS3 world, is there a better, more dynamic way where we could automatically get rid of all the languages that are not that specific language? So I put that on you as a homework assignment. You could use JavaScript or you could use CSS. Try to figure out a way, before you watch the next few lectures, try to find a way, how could you get rid of all the irrelevant languages, all the languages that are not the default language that we want? I'm fine with you having the default language that you want up above here. What we want is everything. If we, let's say I set it to be French. This is the language I want this application to be in. This page should be rendered in French. What this means basically is whenever I serve the French people or the Canadian French, all I have to do is change this HTML tab. All the rest is completely the same. If I change this one thing or I do it with JavaScript, then that's all I have to change. And in that case, we want to get rid of all the stuff that are not. So anything that is lang English would disappear. Anything that's lang CA would disappear. And that's your goal. Try to find out, is there a way for you to do this in a dynamic way? How about starting without a dynamic way? But if you know a little bit of JavaScript, go for it. If you don't know JavaScript, try to search up the selectors. Look into our referrals in the end of the chapter. Try to figure it out before you watch the lecture, because that's one of the things that we're going to encounter very soon. So see you in the next lecture where we continue exploring rules of CSS, and I hope you will take that break and take up on that challenge.